The number was 14 millimeters. That was the Bureau of Meteorology's forecast rainfall for the Wimmera district of Victoria for the last week of April 1983. 14 millimeters. Printed in the weekly agricultural forecast summary that went out to extension offices, rural newspapers, and the grain growers who had learned over years of dry seasons to read the Bureau's numbers the way a doctor reads a chart, not for what they said, but for what they meant. Most of the growers in the district read 14 millimeters and thought, rain is coming. Colin Firth read 14 millimeters and checked the soil moisture index. That was the difference. The 1982 to 83 drought across southeastern Australia was one of the most severe on record. The El Niño event that drove it had produced rainfall deficits across Victoria that had been accumulating since the previous spring. The Wimmera, wheat country, predominantly dryland, dependent on autumn and winter rainfall to establish the crop and carry it through to harvest, had received approximately 40% of its average annual rainfall in the 12 months preceding April 1983. The Wimmera in 1983 was not a wealthy farming district. It had never been a wealthy farming district in the way that the irrigation country to the north or the fat soil zones of Gippsland to the east were wealthy. What it had was scale and reliability, large farms on reliable rainfall that, in average years, produced consistent wheat and barley yields, and supported operations built on thin margins and long time horizons. The farmers who stayed in the Wimmera across generations did so because they understood that the margin for any given year was not the point. The point was the decade. A good decade covered the bad years and left something over. The 1982 to 83 drought was threatening to consume more than 1 year's margin. By April 1983, many operations in the district had already drawn down their cash reserves through 2 successive below-average seasons. The decision about whether to sow, and how much to sow, and on what ground, was not merely an agronomic question. It was a capital allocation question. Seed, fertilizer, and fuel for a full sowing program on 1,000-plus acres represented a material outlay. If the crop failed to return its variable costs, that outlay was gone. The topsoil was not merely dry. It was depleted in a way that a single rainfall event could not address. The profile moisture, the water stored in the soil column below the surface, which plant roots accessed through the growing season, had been drawn down to levels that made germination and establishment a significant risk, even with some rainfall. Colin Firth understood this in a specific, operational way because he had been tracking it. He farmed 1,100 acres near Horsham in the heart of the Wimmera. He had been growing wheat and barley on this ground since 1969, when he had taken over from his father at 26 years old and immediately encountered a dry autumn that had taught him, in his first season of management, that the Wimmera's rainfall was not to be assumed. He had kept a soil moisture log since 1971, a hand-recorded notebook in which he tracked, after each rainfall event, his estimate of moisture at 3 soil depths: surface, 30 centimeters, and 60 centimeters. The method was simple. After any rainfall event of 5 millimeters or more, he walked 3 representative paddocks on the property and pushed a steel probe into the ground at each depth, pulling a soil core and assessing the moisture by feel, the way his father had taught him, the way most dryland farmers of his generation had learned before moisture meters became standard equipment. Wet soil at 30 centimeters felt a particular way in the hand. Dry soil felt different. Marginal soil, the kind that was technically present but would not sustain a root system under pressure, fell in between, and recognizing that middle category was a skill that took years of comparison against actual crop outcomes to develop. Colin had been developing it since 1971. By 1983, he had 12 years of probe records, alongside 12 years of yield results from the same paddocks. He knew what a 30-centimeter reading of a certain quality had historically produced in terms of final grain yield, and he knew how many of those readings had been optimistic and how many had been pessimistic, and how to adjust his interpretation accordingly. The log was not scientific in the laboratory sense. It was practical in the farming sense. Consistent methodology applied over 12 years to the same ground, producing a record that told him not just whether the soil was wet or dry today, but how today compared to every other April in his log. In April 1983, his log told him the profile was the driest it had been at this point in the season since he had started keeping records. 12 years of records. And I don't think he started that notebook because he saw 1983 coming. He started it because he was the kind of man who wanted to understand his own ground. Same 3 paddocks, same probe, same notebook after every rain. Most years it probably didn't change a single thing he did, but it was adding up the whole time. And when 1983 hit, that notebook was worth more than anything else on that farm. Not because he was smarter than anybody, just because he'd done one simple thing long enough for it to matter. The Bureau's 14-millimeter forecast was a probability-weighted estimate for the district. It reflected the chance of rainfall occurring, the likely distribution across the district if it did occur, and the forecast total if the synoptic pattern developed as modeled. It was not a guarantee. It was not a promise. The Bureau did not issue guarantees or promises. It issued forecasts. What 14 millimeters meant to most growers was this: rain is forecast, enough to get the crop in, time to prepare for seeding. The standard autumn cropping window in the Wimmera ran from late April through May, and a forecast of 14 millimeters in the last week of April was consistent with the opening of that window. Growers who had their seed ready, their ground prepared, and their machinery serviced were right to read 14 millimeters as a signal to be ready. Colin read it as something more conditional than that. His soil moisture log showed the profile at 30 centimeters running at approximately 35% of field capacity, the lowest April reading in his 12-year record. At 35%, a germinating seed had access to barely adequate moisture at the surface following a rainfall event, but the root system would be chasing a profile that was not there. Once the surface moisture from the rainfall event evaporated or was consumed by the young plant, the roots would need to find moisture deeper in the profile. In a normal year, there was moisture deeper in the profile. In April 1983, there was not. He worked through the arithmetic on the back of the forecast sheet. 14 millimeters of rainfall on soil at his current profile state would wet the surface. It would not recharge the 30-centimeter layer to a level he considered adequate for a full sowing program. The plants would germinate, they would emerge. They would then be farming the same depleted profile that the 14 millimeters had fallen on. He needed 35 to 40 millimeters across the next 2 weeks to consider the profile adequately recharged for a full program. 14 millimeters in the last week of April, with no follow-up rain in the Bureau's extended outlook, was not 35 to 40 millimeters. He made his decision before the rain fell. He was not going to sow his full program. In the last week of April 1983, 17 millimeters of rain fell in the Horsham district, slightly above the Bureau's forecast, distributed over 3 events across 4 days. The rain was welcome. It was genuine rainfall, not a trace event. The growers who had been waiting for it began preparing to sow. Colin had already decided what he was going to sow and what he was not. He sowed 420 acres, the ground with the deepest soil profile on his property, the paddocks where his moisture log showed the best retention from previous seasons, the areas he considered most likely to carry a crop through to harvest, even if follow-up rainfall was limited. The remaining 680 acres he left. His neighbors sowed their full programs. In May, another 12 millimeters fell, below average, below what was needed to maintain the young crops in the ground his neighbors had sown on the depleted profile. The May rain was enough to keep the crops alive, not enough to give them the root depth they needed before the dry period that typically followed in early summer. In June, 8 millimeters. In July, the rainfall pattern that the Bureau's extended outlooks had been signaling, a continuation of the El Niño dry pattern, arrived and did not leave. The Wimmera's winter rainfall for 1983 came in at approximately 55% of average. The crops that had been sown on depleted profiles in late April ran out of accessible moisture in late July and early August, when the grain was in the critical filling stage. The yield result was determined not by what happened at flowering, but by what had been in the soil profile in April, when the decision to sow had been made. Colin's 420 acres, sown on the best ground with the deepest retained moisture, came in at an average of 1.8 tons per hectare, below his 10-year average of 2.4, but adequate, a crop that covered its costs and left him in a functional position for the following season. His neighbors' full programs averaged 0.9 tons per hectare on the paddocks, sown on depleted profiles. Some paddocks did not reach the threshold for commercial harvest and were cut for hay or left entirely. The financial difference between Colin's result and the district average was not simply a matter of yield, it was a matter of what had been spent to produce that yield. Colin had purchased seed and fertilizer for 420 acres. His neighbors had purchased seed and fertilizer for 800, 900, 1,000 acres. On the paddocks that failed to reach commercial yield, that input cost had been spent against a return of 0. Colin's cost exposure had been proportional to his sown area. His neighbors' cost exposure had been proportional to their full programs. In a district where operating margins were already thin from 2 previous difficult seasons, the difference between spending for 420 acres and spending for 900 acres, when the outcome on half those acres was a write-off, was the difference between finishing 1983 in a workable position and finishing it with reserves depleted and the operating line drawn further down than it had been in January. The twist of the 1983 season in Colin's case was not that he had found a way to win. It was that he had found a way to lose less than the district average. And in a year like 1983, that was the only winning available. The conversation Colin had with his neighbor Peter Sanderson in October, after harvest, was the kind of conversation that happens between farmers when one of them has had a materially different outcome from the other, and both of them are trying to understand why. Peter had sown 900 acres. He had harvested a crop that, on average, had not returned its variable costs. His seed and fertilizer investment on the paddocks that failed to reach commercial yield had produced nothing recoverable. He was not facing foreclosure. His operation had the reserves to absorb one bad season. But the 1983 result had moved him materially backward after 2 years that had already been difficult. He asked Colin what he had seen that he hadn't. Colin showed him the soil moisture log. He showed him the April entry, the 30-centimeter reading, the calculation on the back of the Bureau's forecast sheet. He explained how he had used the 14-millimeter forecast not as a green light, but as an input in a calculation that also required knowing what the soil could hold and what it was currently holding. Peter looked at the log for a long time. He turned back to the earlier pages, 1975, 1977, 1980, comparing the April entries against what he could recall of those seasons' outcomes. The pattern was there in the handwriting. The years with good April profile moisture had produced good crops, and the years with depleted profiles had produced variable results depending on whether follow-up rainfall had materialized. 12 years of that pattern, written in pencil in a notebook, was a different kind of forecast than anything the Bureau issued. He said he had looked at the Bureau's number and thought, "Rain is coming. Time to sow." Colin said that was the right response to 14 millimeters in a normal year. In 1983, with the profile in the condition it was in, 14 millimeters had meant something different. Peter asked how long Colin had been keeping the log. "Since 1971, Colin said. 12 years. Peter was quiet for a moment. Then he said that 12 years of records was a significant thing to have in a year like this one. Colin agreed. He also said, and this was the part Peter remembered more clearly than anything else from that conversation, that the log had been nearly useless for the first 3 or 4 years, that you couldn't use a single year's records as a decision tool, that it took long enough to build the comparison before the pattern became visible. Peter started his own log the following April. And that part stays with me. He couldn't go back and read 12 years of records he'd never kept. But he could start. The log Colin had in 1983 wasn't built for 1983. It was built from 12 years of ordinary seasons that didn't need it. That's the only reason it was there when it mattered. You don't build that kind of record during the hard year. You build it in all the years before. The 1982-83 drought is remembered in the Wimmera primarily for its scale, the rainfall deficits, the failed crops, the economic damage to a district that had been under pressure since the late 1970s, from a combination of input cost increases and commodity price weakness. What is less visible in that history is the variation within it. Not every grower in the Wimmera had the same 1983. The season was defined by the drought, but outcomes within that drought varied according to decisions made in April, decisions that required information the Bureau's forecast did not supply. The Bureau had correctly forecast 14 millimeters. It had not forecast what 14 millimeters would mean to a crop sown on a profile that had been depleted for 18 months. That was not the Bureau's job. That was the farmer's job. Colin Firth had done that job because he had 12 years of records telling him what the profile looked like, and because he had been trained by his father and by his own difficult first season in 1969 to ask a second question after reading any forecast. Given what the soil is carrying right now, what does this number actually mean? Most of his neighbors had asked the first question only. The answer to the first question, "Rain is coming," was correct. The answer to the second question, "Is it enough, given where we are?" was different and harder, and was the one that mattered in April 1983. This distinction is not a criticism of the neighbors who sowed their full programs. They made a reasonable decision based on a genuine rainfall forecast in a district where the standard response to an autumn forecast was to be ready to sow. Most seasons, that response was right. The Wimmera's farming system had been built on that response, the assumption that autumn rain, when it came, was the signal to plant. What 1983 required was something the system was not designed to supply automatically. A second layer of analysis that asked not whether rain was coming, but whether the rain that was coming was enough, given the condition of the ground it was falling on. Colin had that second layer because he had built it over 12 years in a blue notebook. Not every farmer in the Wimmera had 12 years of probe records from the same paddocks. Most of them had the Bureau's forecast and their own judgment, and the accumulated habit of responding to autumn rain by sowing. That habit had served the district well for decades. In 1983, it was not enough. The number was 14 millimeters. For most of the district, it meant rain is coming. For Colin, it meant not enough, but enough for 420 acres of the right ground. That was the difference.